Okay, perfect. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to our virtual talk on the art of transforming loss, led by artists Judy Baca and Amalia Mesa-Bains. My name is Davida Prasad. I'm the programs manager here at Spark. For those of you who may be new to Spark, it stands for the Social and Public Art Resource Center. Our organization was founded in 1976 by 3 incredible women artists, including Judy Baca, who we're joined by tonight. And for the past 44 years, our work has focused on producing, preserving, and presenting socially engaged murals and artwork on a local, national, and international scale. So tonight, I'm pleased to introduce you to our speakers, Judy Baca and Amalia Mesa-Bains. In addition to co-founding Spark and serving as our artistic director, Judy is recognized as a leading visual artist, muralist, and educator. Her work begins with an awareness that the land has memory, and she creates art that is shaped by an interactive relationship between history, people, and place. And we're also joined tonight by Amalia Mesa-Bains, who is an internationally renowned artist, scholar, and curator. Her work has expanded understandings of Latina and Latino artist references to spiritual practices and traditions through her altar installations, her articles, and her exhibitions. So Judy and Amalia, we're so pleased to have you here tonight with us. And for all of you in the Zoom room, thank you also for joining us tonight. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Judy. I think you might be muted.
There. Now I'm back. Can you hear me? Okay. First of all, I'm very excited to be here with my dear friend Amalia Mesa-Bains, my comadre, my soul sister, my cultural warrior friend, and someone that I have been having conversations with since about 1975. And one of our favorite things to do is to go into a conversation in which we explore all these topics and all these ideas. And often we find that we're thinking about the same thing at the same time. So tonight, we have a hard thing to deal with. And I think also a really important discussion to have. And as I'm looking at Davida on the screen, I'm seeing Sparks building the old Venice jail. And of course, in 1929, that was a place where people were incarcerated, and in some cases, badly treated and abused. And that has been a process of transformation.
Or I count what you count what.
I'm sorry. Was that I was going to say that the development of that building, or the transformation of that building, has been like 40 years long. Cleaning it of its previous spirits and bringing it into a different place. So that's one of the examples of the notion of memory and the transformation of a particular site of public memory. Tonight, we're going to start by talking about the process of death within the current context of COVID-19 and our need for healing. And of course, this is the most difficult time because it is a time in which all of the rituals and the methods of dealing with our loved ones and loss have changed and have made it impossible for us to sit by a bedside, to hear the last words of a person we love, to console them, and to be with their body as they pass and watch the spirit leave. And so we are in the process now of over 1.2 million people in the world, 235,000 people in the United States that have been lost to this disease. And we are struggling with a whole new way of mourning and a whole new way of loss. And there's no person I would rather speak to about this than Amalia Mesa-Bains, because she has worked deeply within cultural traditions that are related to death and to rituals that are about reclaiming memory and dealing with loss. So welcome, Amalia.
Thank you, Judy. Yes.
Lovely to see you.
It is good. And we have been having these conversations for many, many years. We used to have something called the 5-year plan. And every 5 years we would do this formal thing, and Judy would draw a body, and then we would highlight it with our goals and visions for the future. We haven't done it for a while. We may need to do it soon.
Yes, I
But
think so.
one of the things that we've shared over time in our lives, of course, is both the personal and the collective. And I think that in some sense, that's at the heart of this discussion today, this conversation. Personally, some of you have lost people to the COVID. No one is super close to me, but some distant friends. But what I think is the collective that is maybe that we have to take account of is that when nearly 250,000, really it will be soon enough, in this country have died, and say you just randomly pick 10 as the number of close family and friends that would be affected, then you can see the numbers of emotional energy that is being traumatized by this. And that to me is what it is we're dealing with. It's the individual, but it's also the collective. A sense of a kind of malaise that has affected all of us, even when we have no one close to us. Just the sense that every day we are losing people. And we know that many of those people fall into the categories of elderly, which some of us are, or Black and brown communities, working class community, and women. And so it's some almost unthinkable, and yet we're forced to deal with this. So some of the things that Judy and I have talked about is, what do we do in these times? It has been most recently Day of the Dead. So that has come up even maybe in a more obvious way, because communities across the country who do practice the Days of the Dead have had to account for those hundreds of thousands of dead. And then we've had to figure out how it is that we can move forward when we don't have the usual traditions. And I was telling Judy that I've been thinking a lot about how so many different cultures have different traditions by which they mourn the dead. Sitting Shiva, the Japanese tradition of the 49 days, every so many weeks you acknowledge again, so that the process of letting go of someone is a very, it's sort of like a pathway. It doesn't happen overnight. And even among groups like ourselves, Chinese, Japanese, people of African descent, the role of the ancestor is part of that. So I keep thinking about the people who have died and how they have become the ancestors. And we turn to our ancestors on Days of the Dead because we believe in some way they represent wisdom, protection, love, and all of those things are in a process that we're not so much delaying as transforming. And so I think that's why we're here talking today, is what are the traditions and ways in which we can do that. And Judy and I have talked about it on the level of just community practices. And for me, of course, the Days of the Dead have been an area that I have made my way through for many, many years, starting really in the late 60s, early 70s. So some of the pieces that I did with the Galería de la Raza, or I did one with Spark or the Mexican Museum, those are pieces that have become part of a vocabulary for me. And so when I think about the process of mourning, letting go, transforming grief, I know that, and this is very personal because this last year and a half ago, I lost my sister, who was very close to me, and some of you knew her, Judith Mesa. And I know for firsthand experience that the first level is really just the shock of it. Even when you think you're prepared, you're not. Even when they've been sick, even when you've taken care of them, you're not ready to let people go. And then that transforms itself into a more pervasive sense of loss once you've gotten through all of the procedures. Well, people now don't have those procedures. They don't have the funeral. They don't have the memorial. They can't sit with the body. They can't do any of the things that have consoled us in the past. And I know for myself that the stage that I'm still in, which is the one of recollection, I think is maybe the one that is most useful to people now who can't be with the people in the process of losing, and now they're living with the loss. So when I think of recollection, I think of the most obvious things like photographs and how we gather them and we look at them and we try to remember all the things that we shared with them. And it's hard because it takes a while to realize what you've lost, and you have to process through that. And the forms and the rituals, the objects, the things that belong to them, all of those things are part of the process that, for us doing the Days of the Dead or any other form like the home altar, are very, very critical. So I think maybe we're going to see, oh, this is the one that I did for my sister, Judith Mesa, at the Oakland Museum. And for those people who know my work, this is actually an excerpt or a sampling from an earlier piece, from a Holy Communion piece from the Venus Envy series. My sister, throughout her lifetime, was a great beauty, both inside and out. And we shared a love of beautiful things. And so I lent her my vanity for the Days of the Dead. And on it, I placed all the objects that reminded me of her, including the photographs. And I made her a little rug of lavender, because smell activates the sense. And when you're recollecting, and people may know this, a smell can bring a memory back. And my sister loved the smell of lavender. So I made her the lavender rug, and the paper flowers on the ground are from her memorial that we had at our home. And in general, I would say that the process of doing this, collecting all the pieces, the 4 or 5 days that I worked at the museum with many friends helping me and family coming to bring things for the offerings, was probably the first turning point in my being able to step back from that most painful part of the loss. And so I think that for people who are now going through this process, some of these practices can be useful. And I think maybe now, Judy, we might talk about just memory as a function.
Right. Well, this is the process as an artist of being able to make something that becomes a vessel for memory. It becomes a place, a site of public memory, is what Amalia and I long ago realized that we shared. We talked about circumscribing space and actually creating a notion that in a particular place, the memory becomes apparent. And you know, the susto that you're dealing with now for the loss of your sister, is something that needs to be healed. And I think, you know, we'll talk a little bit about curandismo down the way here, but there is also community susto. There is the susto of the loss of memory of an entire people, for example, of their history, or their erasure from the landscape through gentrification. And the kind of notion of going to a place and seeing that place transformed, and the story of your parents who owned the little mom and dad grocery store no longer being there, or that the fact that this was a site where there was a wonderful ofrenda that commemorated somebody who passed in that particular place, and that now it has been erased. That is also true about entire histories of people. And perhaps, you know, the image behind me is a perfect example of the circumscribing of space. And much like Amalia's altar, although on a different scale, it is the Los Angeles River and the erasure of the river, the concreting of the river, which in a sense killed the river. The river was turned into a hardened artery in the land. And therefore, that notion of healing the river and its relationship to the stories of the people who lived around the river or next to the river is part of what motivated me to begin this crazy idea that I would just keep painting an endless wall and recovering those stories. And why I call that metaphorically a tattoo on the scar where the river once ran. In a sense, the tattoo was the notion of actually embedding in the skin of the river, in the place that it once was, the stories of the people who lived around the river, the stories that were also disappeared. So there's very much a similarity of going to a particular site, the scent, the smell, the character where the river ran embodies a site of public memory. And I think that's one of the things that we hold in common, this notion that
Yes.
we can, we want to go to the place where something occurred. It's like why people go to the Wailing Wall, or why they go to Gettysburg, where people died on that battlefield. They want to feel that particular moment. They want to feel the spirit of the presence of that story. And in a sense, that's what you've done with the altar. When you go to that space and the scent comes up with the lavender, and you can sit at the vanity table and look in the mirror, and I can pretty much, picture Judy there, and her wonderful putting on of her red lipstick and her makeup and brushing that beautiful black hair of hers. So it calls up for me memory of her and her presence within your house and within your life, because she was a constant. In a sense, you were her mother for so many years. And behind you are all of these objects. So we're looking at these beautiful things that are all from memory, right?
Yes,
The calling up of memory.
it's my family altar that's in my backdrop. It's funny, Judy, when you're talking, I'm thinking about how we both ended up at Fort Ord.
Yes.
Strange place that we found ourselves going to. You talked me into it. Okay, this is the real story of my ending up at Cal State University, Monterey Bay. And Judy talked me into it. First, she tricked me and said, "Oh, let's get Richard to run the music department." So I said, "Oh, that's great. So Richard will go, and I'll just be the cheerleader, and I'll help you and Suzanne, and we'll just keep each other company." And then Judy at the last minute says, "I'm not going to be able to do it. I think I'm going to go to UCLA, and they've offered me this or that, and I have work I have to do there." So she said, "But I think you could do it." And so I ended up becoming the head of the visual and public art department in a godforsaken military base. And I thought, why did I agree? But the one thing we discovered when we got there was, and Judy had been there several times before me, and she and Johanna had done a project. I hope she'll talk about windows. And this is within that notion that memory resides not just in people, but in places. Soja, the social theorist, says that no place is empty when we reach it. There are the ghosts of those who came before. And he even writes a lot about how space can be made to hide consequences from us, how relations of discipline and power are inscribed in apparent innocent spatiality of social life, and how human geographies can be filled with politics and ideology. And this is the story of a place like Fort Ord, where literally thousands of young men went from the very first World War II, the Korean War, and powerfully during the Vietnam War, many of whom never came back again. So we found ourselves in this place, sort of, swords into plowshares, trying to make a university. But the first thing we had to deal with was a different kind of loss. It wasn't personal, although some of us had family who had been on the base and had not returned home. But what we had to heal was the land itself. And so Judy and Johanna and Stephanie Johnson and others all put together projects recognizing the lives of people who had been on that base. And so we thought that that was sort of our first curriculum, the excavation of a space of loss and violence and war and death, and that we couldn't move forward to do the kind of learning and compassionate work that we believed in if we didn't find a way to acknowledge that past. So I think that's, I don't think we have images, but maybe Judy would talk about the windows.
Yes, I think it was the idea I had when I first came onto the base was that it was a boarded up series of barracks. But as you were saying, what was so profound about that place was that almost like you could hear the marching soldiers, you could feel the susto, the fear that young men had as they were leaving to go to battle. as they were being sent off to these places. And it went back through all of the history of American war. And so the barracks that were empty, and of course the first thing I did is I selected the military tank buildings to be our mural studios, which was actually one of the better thoughts. Those giant buildings were perfect for mural spaces. And later we would bring the Palestinians and the Israeli artists to work in those spaces and create a piece that was a collaboration. But so what we did with the barracks is that we started to paint portraits of individual soldiers that came through Fort Ord, and they were portraits. And it was also about a sense of what they said about that experience. So not only did we bring their memory back, but also if we could, we recovered what they felt about their own memory of being at Fort Ord. And we actually made a little bit of a film about it. And one of the amazing things was the man behind the camera the day we were shooting began to shake as he was shooting. And I kept seeing the camera jump. And I said, "Are you okay?" And he said, "Well, not really." He said, "I was here and you're calling up all of this for me. And I went to Vietnam from here." And so we turned the camera on him, and he told his story about being one of the soldiers in Fort Ord. So Annette, again, the notion of the transformation of these spaces that had a purpose and a meaning that transformed the lives of people, and how one actually changes that into something that is more positive and is constructive. And I'm forever grateful that you took over the program and you were able to do it. You and Richard did an amazing job in Fort Ord. I, of course, had to go because of a hunger strike at UCLA to go to work at Chicano Studies. And that's how I ended up back at UCLA. But what we're describing here is that, what gentrification does, for example, in a community where it disappears a group of people to do a development, or the notion of undeveloped land. In other words, the land that is perfect and does not have any buildings on it or has not been developed is undeveloped, as if it's not perfect in itself, but must be transformed by the infusion of other ideas over it. And we've of course dealt with that throughout the Southwest, and particularly as people moved from the East into the West, and the original peoples, the indigenous people, the Latinos who inhabited this whole region were disappeared and moved and gentrified, and their stories and their histories were lost. So we're talking about loss on so many different levels. Here during this period of COVID, we're doing one by one, and this event, of course, is in commemoration of our 18th annual Day of the Dead event. And we were perplexed, like, how would we do our community altar, in which we asked people to bring to one site the memories of their loved ones. And so we thought we would do this virtually. And I think maybe Davida could bring up a few of those images. And something happened when we did this in this particular way. So we're sort of going back and forth. We of course, Amalia and I moved seamlessly in between each other's art forms. So we're now going into the realm of Amalia's work. This is a virtual gallery. It is up now, and we're going to come through a series of memories of historic events here at Spark, where we created our Day of the Dead. And we asked people, where hundreds of people participated in it. These were big events, and very celebratory with music and dance. And so these are some of those events. And of course, the other part of the altar building is also that, given to us by the tradition of Posada, is that they often are critical. The altar will call out something that is a story of a particular moment, which the artists and the people are critical. And so you can go online and you can see this site, and you can also add your own people to the site, and we will include you in our altar and to the dead. But what happened is you go through the trail of Cempasúchil into the the back figure, which is the calaca, you'll pass the images of various people who contributed their loved ones to this particular site. And you can go on this gallery and you can see the gallery, and you can also see who is in this remembrance. And what happened is that because they were being loaded one by one, we were in fact much more intimate with each person's loss. And it became, even though we were talking about 1.2 million people who had passed, and 235,000 people in the United States, we were looking at it. If you move just to the left here, we lost my cousin this year, and there he is working on one of the murals. And so the story of each of these, we also lost Charles Freeman, who was one of the great African-American muralists in Los Angeles. So you can see him next to his scaffolding. So each person is memorialized in this site.
Oh, no.
And each one became an individual story rather than a giant group altar. So anyway, this is the way the altar has been built, and the way that we have managed to do this virtually. And there's some aspects of this virtual world. Well, we can't touch each other, we can't hold each other's hands, and we can't wipe each other's tears. We can create a space that is in the ether, that is in a sense in the spirit world, that does this remembrance. And maybe there's aspects of our virtual life that we can continue into the future. And I'm thinking about, Amalia's murals, her altars, having a virtual life, and forever sort of embedded in my memory. The Dolores del Rio image, for example, her altar, that this magnificent altar that is now owned by the Smithsonian. It's never going to be back in our world because it's now at the Smithsonian, but the memory of that particular image that is a homage to Dolores del Rio is forever in my mind, and has stayed embedded there, both in the spirit and also in the physical world. So this gives you an idea of another method of how we can mourn and transform loss. And of course, the placing of the objects that people owned, which Amalia talked about. But also there's something about handling those objects and, communing with a person lost. And we look at the ancient traditions that really is in our DNA as Latinos, and looking back to the ancients and seeing how they honored the dead and how they did this calling of the spirits from the top of their buildings and asked them to come and join them for the fiesta with food and drink and their favorite things. There's also methods that my family practiced. My grandmother, who practiced curandismo in a sort of mixed way between being highly religious as a person and also an indigenous woman. These limpias that she carried out were important methods of taking away the susto. And maybe, Mali, you want to talk a little bit about some of these, because you've done some work on
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was very lucky, like Judy, to have my grandmother in my life. And my grandmother was not a curandera, but she had borrowed practices from curanderas and had taken my father and my uncles to curanderas whenever they experienced anything that was traumatic. When they lived in Los Angeles, which probably would have been in the, let's see, 40s, 30s and 40s. They lived on an alley, and she would send my uncles off to the store. They would go the back way, and once they went and they witnessed a shooting, a man was shot in the back of the head. And they were very frightened, and they ran back and told her what happened. So she promptly called a curandera. And so for several days, they developed different treatments. Sometimes they roll an egg over the body because the body is seen as manifesting the shock or fear. And so, for those who don't know about curanderismo, it has certain characteristics. And the image you see on the screen is called the Curanderas Botanica, and that is my grandmother, Mariana, in the light box. And I did this piece when I was recovering from a very serious automobile accident. This is 2008. I had the accident in 2003 and didn't make work for 5 years. And during that period of time, I had multiple surgeries because I broke my neck, my arm, my leg, shattered my wrist and my elbow. Oh, I can't remember all of them, but it took a long time. I'm sort of like Humpty Dumpty, and they had to put me back together again. And during that period of time, I returned to some of the earlier sort of learnings, and that partly had to do with my grandmother, but also with a psychologist, a Jungian psychologist who was my mentor when I was in graduate school on my PhD in clinical psych, and his name was Ronaldo Maduro. And Ronaldo was one of the first people, also with Concha Salcedo and others, who took the traditions, the Mexican traditions of curanderismo, and brought them into the therapeutic practice. So when I studied with him, he explained to me, and then also I knew this from my lived experience with my grandmother, that the premise of curanderismo, which is not unlike like Andrew Weil or Deepak Chopra, the premise is the inseparability of the mind and the body. They are connected. And there is a mediation between the earthly and the divine. We see ourselves as connecting between the living and the dead. And I've always believed that healing is the process when we go from living to death, that in order to die well, to be able to let go, you have to have a certain measure of healing that's occurring. And also that healing in of itself is never really an individual experience. It's collective, and sometimes it might involve other members of your family, people in your community. So that idea that healing is collective, I think is really pervasive in the work that both Judy and I do, because we do work, she in the public sector, me with the ofrendas, in which sometimes our art serves as a sort of interstice for other people to step into for their own sense of well-being. And in the diagnostic sort of framework of curanderismo, susto, which can be described in Western terms as shock, fear, or bilis, which is when people are very angry and cannot manage their rage, and we know people like that. Empache, which can be in babies like colicky and other people's stomach problems, often arises from competitiveness or jealousy. So these treatments, which can include limpias, which use herbs or eggs rolling over, and the egg is diagnostic because the curandera can crack the egg after, or sometimes they roll it over the body, then crack it, put it in a bowl under the bed, and then a day or two later, they will take it out and look. And how the egg curdles or what it does is a way of reading the emanations of the energy of the person who's ill. And also there is some prayer, of course. Some people use water as a treatment, different measurements of water and drinks at certain intervals. When I had the accident and I had such a hard time healing from it, not just physically, because I did what the Western doctors told me, but I experienced a real deep loss of energy, a listlessness, which with shock and trauma is not unusual. But in curanderismo, we believe that the shock, if it's great enough, can cause the soul to flee the body. Your soul leaves you. And when your soul is gone from you, you really aren't yourself and you don't have that kind of energy. So I had to have limpias, and I did a lot of prayer and meditation. And my friend Pepon Osorio, another artist, he flew in from, I think he was in Puerto Rico at the time, and he set up glasses of water at the highest part of the room I was in, because I had to sleep in a hospital bed for almost 3 years because I couldn't really do the chairs because my leg was not healing properly. And he said that water, eventually it evaporates, takes away with it the negative energy, the fear that is in your body. So I learned to do both the things that the doctors told me, the surgeries and the rehabilitations, but I also relied on belief systems very, very much about how the mind and the body are connected. And of course, because I was trained as a psychologist, I really did understand that different experiences that you have emotionally will show up in your body. And so for me, curanderismo is not necessarily a formal practice, but I look to it as a sort of tool for understanding what's happening to me. And I think in the time we're in now, people are looking for healing. I saw something yesterday about anxiety, the incredible levels of anxiety that we are experiencing now. And they talked about going out in nature, understanding that the natural world offers us a space of reconciliation, and that often just stepping outside and going on a short walk can give us a better feeling. If we're not glued to the TV for bad news or whatever, we need to go out in the light and feel that and experience it. Those of us who are lucky enough to be with someone that we're close with have touch. Some people don't have touch because they're alone. All of these things, I think, are processes that in this time of crisis, of death and loss, that we're really struggling with. But I go back to the idea that we're almost the best practitioners of our own illnesses, our own bodies. If we spend time thinking of ourselves and with ourselves, and whether you call it self-care or whatever else it's named, there's something about understanding what's happening to us and recognizing it that takes some of the power away from the negative feelings that we have. But I do think that someone will be in the process of doing it, maybe many people. But as we pass through this pandemic, and it may take much longer than we think, I think there will be people developing memorial practices, calling out the names, writing the names somewhere, that we cannot allow all of these deaths to go unrecognized, to become anonymous to us. So whether we pick the people from our area or people develop some process in their family homes and they share it with the people closest to them, I think that this will happen in time. I really have to believe we will pass through this with some new mechanism, some new practice that will help us deal with this enormous death. I don't know what you think about that, Judy, but I've been
I think that's
really
actually
reflecting on it a lot.
I think that's really true. And I fear we're going to run out of time before we can get, we've so many thoughts coming up here. But one of the images that I wanted to show is the Robert Kennedy site. Because let's look at the Robert Kennedy piece if we could, because I wanted to talk a little bit about how the making of things, the actual making of the image or the spirit of that experience becomes part of that process. So, you know, when Pepon came and created that kind of visualization for you of the water and put it at a high place, he gave it a sort of he circumscribed space, he created a magical space for you, and it began to be the embodiment of your healing. Well, this was actually the embodiment in an image that's a 50-foot image in the site where Robert F. Kennedy was killed. And it was going to become a library for kids. And so I was in the process of making, how would you make an image that would be, in a sense, a healing that we had never recovered from, the loss of this leader, the hope for a president in a time when we were looking toward new leadership, and we thought that he embodied that leadership in 1969. And so all of these hands are real people. And I was thinking of that as you were speaking, because those hands, each of them are real people that came to the studio whose hands I photographed and then I painted. And they're holding up Robert Kennedy as if they're holding up the ideas that he stood for. And that became a way of us collectively taking our energy and bringing it to this site, which was a site for essentially a terrible murder, and transforming that place into kind of a hopeful sensibility through the creation of imagery. And I think what we have as artists is the capacity to make something, to use our hands, but everyone has the possibility of doing this, whether it's knitting something, that each time you make a stitch, you're thinking of the birth of a new child, for example, or you are remembering your grandmother. You are creating for yourself with the making and the use of your hands, a method of remembrance, a method of process. And we have to actually now externalize those processes in other ways that we cannot do at the bedside of a person that we're losing. And so maybe what we're saying, as we run out of time here, and we want to give people a chance to ask questions and stuff, maybe what we're saying is that we now need to find new methods, and they are creative methods in which we can come together to heal and also to remember. And that our sites, the creation of new sites of public memory and collective loss is what we're seeking. What do you think, Amalia? Here we
I
are.
think that we probably should open it up as we finish up today. That we should open up to the questions, but I just want to acknowledge that I have learned so much from Judy over the years as I've interviewed her starting in the 70s and it's written about her over the years, about the power of public space and how much in these moments in which we're fighting on the front of environmental battles, we're fighting on the front of border atrocities, we're fighting on the front of so many struggles with justice and with compassion, that the work that you've set in place has offered that to so many people over the years. You know, that's part of our job. Art in a way is a vehicle, but the community is our goal. It's where we go, what we're working for. And many people that are on this call today, I see, are other artists and writers and poets and ethicists and people who I know have done the same work in their field. And I can't help but believe in the months and years ahead, we're going to need to marshal all of our communal power to transform the losses that we experience, not just in the deaths, but the losses of our and damage to our healthcare systems, the losses and damage to our environmental life, the losses and damage to our humanity and our compassion, and that all of us will be working toward that goal in some way or another. And so today is just a sort of opening the door to those kinds of conversations. And I'm hoping that more people will join in and have these kinds of conversations with each other and make them available to us, because I know we're going to need it. This is it's a radical time. And, you know, at our age, that's a lot to say because we've watched quite a few over the years.
Yes.
So I want to thank Judy and Spark for inviting me to have this moment with Judy and with all of you. And I guess, Davida, how you'll handle the questions for us?
Sure. I think actually, if you're inclined, you can go ahead and unmute your mic if you have a question or comment for Amalia and Judy or the group. If you are uncomfortable with that, feel free to drop a question or comment into the chat, and I'll read it out loud to them as well.
So we invite you to respond or to ask questions or to add a thought. We could, we just barely touched on the topic.
We have a question from Brooke. Could you speak a little bit about the collective loss we're feeling about the huge vote for Trump this week?
Oh, yes, Amalia and I earlier
Okay.
tonight, they said, should we go
We were
down
going to
that
not
rabbit
talk
hole?"
about the election because it wasn't over yet. But okay,
Yes.
I have to say that we probably shouldn't be shocked. And in that sort of mind-body connection, I have always thought of Trump as a sort of aberrant manifestation of the hidden voices of people who we don't know mostly. So I think the issues of supremacy and racism, misogyny, sexism, all of these things shouldn't maybe be such a surprise to us, but to recognize that after 4 years, when people do know who Trump is and do know what he has been capable of, that they would once again choose in the millions to support him is alarming. And when I said that I thought in the months and years ahead that there is work to do, that's what I was referring to. I think that it isn't just about divisiveness, although that is the manifestation of it, but it's really how those of us who are sometimes the victim of those feelings of misogyny and supremacy, how it is that we recognize where it comes from, deal with it in a way that is not as negative as the experience would dictate. But there is a shock in a way that once again, so many people now knowing what they know, voted for him again. I have to say that is a little bit unnerving, really unnerving.
Yes, I would absolutely echo that. And I think,
Wow.
one of the thing that keeps coming up in my mind is this notion, this whole idea of kind of rugged individualism, rugged machismo. This what he embodies is somehow touched on this idea of individuality over collective, over community, and that you can have what you want or should have what you want, no matter how it affects anyone else. And that, in a sense, has been the premise of the country, beginning with slavery. And so we're paying now, and generation after generation, for the legacy of slavery and the changing of the slaves from one group to the next, in immigrants and the people of color, and that we have not ever dealt with that in a direct and profound way that would transform it. So part of the work we need to do is work on that transformation and the restitution for these particular terrible historical precedents that have created this particular character who's embodying it. And yes, I'm in the shock stage of mourning, which is like, is this really possible? Is this my country? Am I part of this country? And I am embarrassed and horrified by the fact that this is happening to all of us. And what does it mean for the work that those of us who've been active for all of our life to create change and to do work in social justice? What does it mean that we should be doing now? I mean, we have work to do, and we need an entire new generation of young people doing that work.
Well, I think they are. I think the whole Black Lives Matters movement that rose to the surface was the first really powerful sign that people weren't accepting what was going on. And I think if there's any hope at all, it's because this new generation is willing to step forward. And I can't imagine how disillusioning this must be for them to know that those millions voted to maintain the status quo and we're not willing to change. But, I think that as young people, they'll have the energy to keep moving forward. And our job is to be as supportive as we can and take our place when it's required.
We have a few questions in the chat. So first from Cecilia, could you talk about the connections between Chicana spiritual practices, art practices, and African American and Native American practices?
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Well,
I'm
I
trying.
think that they're actually very, very connected.
They're interconnected.
In fact, I think that one of the aspects of, yeah, they're interconnected, and one of the aspects of the early Chicano movement was the prioritizing of indigenous practices. We looked toward the Mesoamerican world because, unlike North American Indians, we were not segregated in the same way. You know, the difference is that in Mexico, the mestizaje, or the mixing of the races, was a model. It wasn't a positive model because it was aligned with all kinds of restrictions depending on which category you fell into. Miscegenation, which was the American or the North American model, didn't even allow us to mix. So Native Americans were put on reservations. In Mexico, that didn't happen. There weren't reservations, but there were certainly restrictions on where people lived. So, you know, a century later, we represent certain aspects as Chicanas of an indigenous heritage, but not necessarily one that's codified in tribal names or registry. At the same time, what I described in Curanderismo and the prioritizing of nature and the idea that we are all visitors on this earth is really a shared concept across most indigenous groups. I've done a lot of work around tercer raíz, or the third root, which is the root of the African diaspora, the slavery brought into the New World. And because in my own family, I think I'm like the third generation interracially married. My grandmother was married to an American Black, so some of my uncles are mixed race, and of course I'm married with Richard Bains. So I took an interest in that long ago, and this is a funny story, but when I first started doing the home altar, Richard wasn't altogether comfortable with it. And I said, well, do you want to put your family pictures on? And at first he said, nah, I'll wait and see. And then eventually he got in the habit of it, and he started putting African, you know, little statues in there. And pretty soon they were started to collect Black saints and Black virgins. And eventually we just had this kind of mezcla of our family life. But in the process of doing that, I studied a lot and recognized that in terms of the African spiritual practices, they emanate from the idea of movement. In other words, you can't realize the divinity in static. You have to move, whether it's dance or singing or wearing masks or moving. Those African practices have permeated the Black churches in the United States. And Richard comes from a very, very large Black family connected with Pentecostal religion. So the first time I went to his church, he made me promise not to testify because he was afraid that the music would get me to my feet. And before I knew it, I would be baptized. And I did restrain myself, but it was very, very hard because the music and the movement. Well, Christianity has always had an understanding of the mediation with the divine in a very stasis way, reflective way. So those two forces, I think, are really almost an opposite to each other. And so over the years, I've kind of tried to figure out how it is that we share this space of spiritual practice between indigenous people, mixed race or the mezcla, and African religions, because they're still so present. Pepo Osorio, Martha Moreno Vega, all the people that have been so close to me over the years from the East Coast, even Juan Bosa, are practitioners of the Yoruba or West African traditions of Santeria, Lukume, and many of the things that I use in my work, in my altars and in my home altar, really cut across those spiritual practices, because people give me things and then I integrate them. So I do find many, many aspects that are interconnected between those areas.
I just have to add that I never knew really where the division was between the indigenous and the Mexicano. You know, like I wore an ambuleta around my neck that my grandmother gave me. I never knew what was inside of it. Yeah. You know, it was like these things were so mixed and so integrated that they were indistinguishable. And one of the things I'm really sure about is that, You know, I think of my grandmother taking a coffee can and filling it with soil and plugging a dead branch into it. And then just a few days later, the thing was blooming with leaves and it was turning green. And the little ritual that she did over the coffee can to ask the permission of that stick to grow and to be put into the coffee can, would it like to be there? Would it grow there? I mean, this, and it reminds me of how going through sites within the reservation, indigenous leaders have shown me that, you know, this particular mountain is where you remember this story and you tell it in this way. And you have the permission of these ancestors to tell it. And that's how young people are trained. They cannot tell the story without indicating where it came from, the permissions that they have to tell it, and that this particular site of public memory, a mountain, a rock, a piece of land, is the reason that you can tell the story in this place. And that's how you remember. So I think these are very important aspects of what we are talking about. And literally they're indistinguishable between various cultures, because we're integrated in these two cultures as Amalia has defined it.
Okay. We have a couple more questions in the chat. So this one is from Sarah. Let me just scroll up. In speaking with other death workers and artists about grief and loss today, the question of what does collective and community mean to a Black individual when the collective we or community has in part caused the grief and suffering. So what do you do when to grieve in community is not safe?
That's a big question, isn't it? I'm not sure how to answer that. I mean, maybe grieving in community has never been safe entirely. Maybe it's the process of creating the space for that. Creating those spaces is part of the healing. But yet, look at people who go into churches and they can be, you know, shot with people coming into a synagogue and shooting up the place. Maybe no public space is safe any longer, and that what we're doing in the you know, the buildings that we've transformed like Spark, or the spaces that we have transformed in community, you know, we are creating those spaces, and those are the spaces of healing. So we must create them because they don't exist naturally, or given the legacy of the history of our country, are they there for us to simply partake in? We are the makers of those spaces. Does that help? Do we have another question?
We do.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this question is from Leela. I'm 19 and in college. How do I balance academics and social justice?
Well, they are the same.
I was going to say, you know,
They are the same.
part of the process of learning is learning in service of something. Learning of itself has value, but until it's integrated into purposeful living, I don't think it is as meaningful. You know, it's the difference between knowledge and meaning. When we teach toward knowledge, we fill people with ideas, but when we teach toward meaning, we give them tools in which to implement that knowledge toward the solution of a problem, toward the giving of compassion to others. That somehow, to me, social justice is like a river that runs through it. But it may be that unless you experience social injustice, you may not find it as relevant. I think we start everything with our own experiences when we're learning. You know, when we come into the classroom, we're not empty. We're not, you know, invisible. We're filled with things. And a good teacher finds a connection between what you represent and what tool they have for giving that knowledge. And it's the connection between your experience and the knowledge that provides you the tool, the meaning. And so I think you might want to question what kind of an academic program you have if social justice is separate from it. And it might be a way to sort of try to integrate it back in so that your learning can be useful to you as a human being that has to live in a world that's often unjust. And just watching the Black Lives Matters protests made me see that in this new generation, the recognition of injustice for people who may not even have experienced it was profound. I mean, many of the people who marched were not from Black communities that suffered those brutalities, but yet in their young hearts, they knew it was wrong. And they felt rage and they felt sometimes fear and compassion, but in that time of marching, they lived social justice. And I don't think they'll ever be the same again. So I hope that your learning is not separate from that. Really.
But that is what transformed us also, Amalia. It was marching in those moments. It was at that, it was the, the Chicano moratorium. It was the, the march to Sacramento. And I think one of the things that's important to remember is what a great man said. Surely the purpose of education is to be of service to others. And that's Cesar Chavez.
Yes.
We have a question from Aurora. Do you think there's a similarity between altars and works from artists that deal with absence, like Doris Salcido? Or if not, what might be the difference?
Oh, totally. I totally think they're connected. One of the shows I was in, I watched Doris work. She was in the show, also it was called Anti-America, and it was at the Center for the Arts at the Eberwinter Garden. She came early and she, of course, was very well established and had quite a few people helping her, but she was doing the piece. For those of you who haven't seen it, it looks like a wall and little boxes are lighted and you see shoes in them. And there's an eeriness to them because you know that the shoes are left behind by people whose lives were taken, either because they're disappeared or they've been murdered. And I watched her work and I remember thinking, oh, she's just making a very large altar because there were many, many little windows and they were covered with some kind of a skin, a gut. And so when the light came from behind it, it had this luminous and eerie quality. Yes, I think, and I learned this in the 80s when I traveled a lot in New York and started working with other Latin American artists, people like I mentioned Juan Bosa, who was a Cuban artist who did things from the Santeria tradition, but also artists who were dealing at that time with the dictatorships in Latin America. And many of them were a diaspora living in New York because they couldn't live in their own countries anymore. And I remember one of the artists telling me that he was on a bus once and the bus was on a road that a river ran next to. And this is when the desaparecidos were happening.
I'm having trouble hearing you.
My phone is talking, my watch is talking to me. And he looked out the window and he said, everyone looked out the window and they saw bodies of people floating down the river, some dismembered. And he said, everyone looked out the window and then they looked down and no one spoke. And when they got off the bus at their destination, no one spoke to anyone else because they knew what it was and it was so terrible. And there was no place to even mourn or discuss it. So a lot of those artists came into New York in the 80s and 90s. And so their work was often about absence. And unlike us, they had experienced an explicit dictatorship with violence. And so their works were all very subtle and almost as though there was a camouflage going on. And in some cases, artists had never even been allowed to gather more than 4 or 5 people because there were watchers in every neighborhood to report back to the fascists that ran the country. So I think that for Chicanos, we were the opposite. We lived in a country where everybody pretended like it wasn't really happening, but it was really happening. And so our expressions toward that repressive discrimination were much more explicit. So our work was much more confrontational. Chicano work in the early days was quite confrontational because I think we thought we had no room to go but to say what we saw and what we thought was really happening to us. So I have looked to the Latin Americans for many years because I think that their work is, it's different, but it's also very powerful and melancholy and often very lyrical. And Doris Salcedo is a perfect example, in my opinion.
Okay, we have one more question. This is from Betsy. Do you ever create portable objects that connect you with your larger pieces of work, but that you can carry with you?
Yes. I have to laugh because I teach my students, or I taught my students to do that. We used to call them pocket altars. And so I would get them to bring in like an Altoid box or some small little thing that they could carry, and they would build a miniature altar in there with sacred objects, pictures of people, and they could carry it in their pocket. I myself for many years carried a rock wrapped in a piece of leather that a mentor of mine gave to me. She was Lakota Sioux, Pat Locke, and she had given it to me because she said you should always carry some kind of a little protective rock or stone with you. So I kept it for years. Now it's in my altar. But I think Judy probably has little portable things she carries around too, because I've seen them at her house.
I do. I do. Sometimes sacred dirt.
Chimayo, I have a little bag.
Yeah, little chimayo.
Yeah.
I believe that was the last question we had, but I'd like to invite you, Judy and Amalia, any last words you can leave us with?
No, just to say really what a pleasure it was to have you join us, Amalia, for this discussion and for us to have another opportunity to talk about some of our favorite things. And I know we could keep going. It's just the tip of the iceberg and so much of what we're dealing with today. And I hope some of this is helpful for the people who are dealing with we're dealing with so much, it's hard to imagine that we can find a way of coping, not only with our losses, but also with the election and with the issues that we're facing. And I send a prayer for finding a solution, getting the children out of the cages and getting our country back into the hands of people that are reasoned and compassionate. So thank you all for joining us.
I feel the same way. I feel like the things that we will need in excess is courage and compassion.
Yes.
Courage because we'll have to be the ones that stand up to see that things are done. And compassion because I think we're going to have to understand in some way who those millions of other people were and try to find a way to move forward without excluding them completely. And somehow healing ourselves. I think that the very big process of healing in this country lies ahead of us. A great deal of healing.
Yes, to
Thank you,
all of
Judy.
yes, thank you, all of our friends out there. We all need to heal ourselves.
Can I just say a very quick thank you with all my heart for this
Josina.
beautiful session. Thank you.
Oh, Josina, you're one of the reasons Judy and I stayed together at CSUMB.
Yes.
And I often said, one of the greatest gifts that Judy ever gave to me was to introduce me to Josina McCoe, because
Yes.
Josina's natural compassion and Buddhist disposition, as well as her profound knowledge of ethics, helped me to make sense out of what we had to do at the Visual and Public Art. And it still guides me to this day.
Yes,
So
and that's
thank you.
why I thought the arts belonged with ethics. because Josina was
Yes.
there.
Thank you with all my heart. Thank you.
Thank you, Josina.
And on behalf of Spark, I'd just like to say thank you, Judy and Amalia, for making time and creating this space for all of us. It was really such a privilege to have you in conversation with each other. There are such wonderful comments in the chat, so I hope you have a chance to look at that. But I think I speak on behalf of everyone in the room to say a major thank you for sharing your work and sharing your insights with us today. And for
I'm
everyone,
very thankful we didn't digress into Cheeseman. I was afraid we would. I was afraid we'd start telling those stories we're not supposed to tell in public. But we
That's
did good.
that's
We
the
did good.
second half. That's the second half of my.
That's another conversation.
Yeah.
absolutely.
Okay.
And to Ruth, thank you so much for being here with us today. I'd just like to encourage you, if you haven't signed up for our newsletter yet, I'm going to drop a link into the chat, and I encourage you to just do that and stay updated with what Spark is up to during this time. And I know it's a heavy moment for all of us, but I'll just ask that when things become lighter and you're thinking about organizations to support, organizations that you can get behind because of the good work that they're doing, that you connect with, that you think about Spark and think about the work that we're doing in public art, in arts activism, arts education, and public programming like this one. So think of us. And again, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And Judy and Amalia, thank you so much again.
Right. Bye-bye.
Bye,
Bye,
Suzanne.
everybody.
Bye, Mary. Bye, Cece. Bye, Gilbert. Who else is there? Bye, Martha.
Bye, guys. See you.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye. 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 Everybody.
Bye.